Guys, I hope you guys are doing amazing wherever you are in the world. Welcome to another episode of the Millionaire Hippie podcast. In this episode, we will be chatting about creativity. As you guys might or might not know, creativity is one of those topics that I love chatting about. It is fascinating to me. The more I am creative, the more I work on my creativity, the more I work with my creativity, the more I understand about it, the brighter my eyes get, the more excited I get about it, and the more excited I get about life in general. It's just one of those beautiful, amazing topics that really enthralls me. It's one of those things that I could talk about for the rest of eternity. In today's episode, particularly, we're going to speak about how as you grow as a creative person, as you grow as an individual, as you grow in this world and you transform yourself, your creativity itself is going to be transformed as well. When I first started being creative, I started writing. Writing is the way I express my creativity, and doing these videos, obviously. Any kind of communication through words is really my forte. And I started writing when I was very young. When I was 7 or 8, I started writing stories. But more than that, I started sharing my stories with my family and friends. I would be sitting around in a circle and I'd be telling them stories that I made up out of my head. And it was just a fun way for me to be creative, to play with the world, to play with my friends, to use my imagination. And I sometimes still do that as well. But mostly, as I've grown up and as I've kind of dealt with the world and as I've written more and more and been more creative, my creativity has really changed and transformed. And the way I used to be creative in the past is not the way I am creative now. For example, when I used to be creative in the past, I used to love writing short stories. As I was very young and it was easier for me to write short stories, it was the easiest thing to do. You just write a quick story and you're done. Also, it was really easy for me to express myself in that format. As I've grown older, and I think it's like 20, 30 years later, now I find it so much easier to just record my thoughts in this video style format and like a vlog and share my words that way. I still love to write and I still love to blog, and I do that every single day. I write every single day. I write my stories. But in order to communicate with the world, I've been finding it much more useful and much more powerful to share my words in a video format. Now, my creativity has transformed. It hasn't changed me as a creative person necessarily. I'm still creative and I'm still loving the process of being creative, and I still love the process of sharing my creativity with the world. But the way I've been doing it has completely changed. Now, in the past, when I used to do that, when I used to change the way I was being creative, when I changed the way I was expressing myself, I used to wonder to myself if I was becoming less creative. Is that the reason why I am changing the way I'm being creative? Is because I'm not as creative anymore. It's easier for me to do these videos than it is for me to write a short story. It takes a little bit more effort for me to write a short story than to do a video. Does that mean that I'm being less creative in this format? Does that mean that I am not as creative as it was in the past? It was easy for me to write short stories when I was a young child. It's not as easy anymore. I have to think a little bit more. I have to put a little bit more effort into it. I have to put a little bit more thought into it. And it takes a lot more time for me to create that story. Does that mean that I'm not as creative anymore? Does that mean that I'm more creative? Does that mean that my creativity has changed? All of the above, probably, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm less creative necessarily, but I'm less creative perhaps in the written format. And I think that's a common thing as we grow up, as we become adults, we lose some of that the quality of imagination, unfortunately, that we had when we were young children, right? I mean, it's so much easier. It was so easy for me to make up a story in my head when I was a child. It's still easy for me to do that, but in certain formats, in certain constraints, under certain constraints, I can create a story, no problem. But to create it in the way that I used to in the past when I was a child is completely different. I don't do that anymore. I'm not the same kind of creative person anymore. But I can speak to you guys right now about it and tell you guys it's all right. It doesn't matter. You don't have to worry about that. People change, creativity changes, we transform as a human being and as a creative person. But for the longest time, for myself, I started berating myself and started telling myself that I wasn't creative anymore. And I stopped writing for a long time because I thought that I had stopped being creative. I'd stopped being an imaginative person. I'd stopped being that person who could create stories out of nowhere. The reason that's one of the reasons I'm doing this post or doing this podcast episode is because so many people message me all the time saying that they're not creative. And I've told you guys this before so many times. In my opinion, every single person on this planet is creative no matter what they do. They might be a creative mother, they might be a creative interior decorator, they might be a creative dresser, they might be a creative business person. No matter what you're doing with your life, every aspect of life requires creativity. So even though I was not being creative necessarily in the past, writing short stories or in the writing aspect of things, I was still being very creative in the way I lived my life. I'd always be taking new routes to work. I was always trying to create new things at work. I was always trying to create new things in my travel, in my life, in my wardrobe, and the way I lived my life. And so there was always a lot of creativity in every aspect of my life. Not necessarily in the writing aspect, because I thought that I had lost it. I thought that in my head, you have to be creative. In the past, I used to think this way, that you have to be creative in a certain way. And if you're not creative in that way, then you're not creative at all. And that's obviously a complete misconception. It was a complete misconception in my head. Now I realize that creativity has so many facets to it, has so many aspects to it. There's so many different ways to be creative. You can be creative in one way or another, and every single person on this planet is creative in their own way. And so there's no one person that I can say this is the only way to be creative, and that's the only way you can create in this world. Especially nowadays, I find that the more I go on Instagram, the more I go on Facebook, and the more I go on the social media networks where different people from all over the world are sharing their creativity, I'm noticing more and more that there are literally a billion trillion ways to be creative. There are people making things out of wood that I never imagined people could make. There are people creating things out of bricks that I never imagined could be possible. There are people creating things out of resin or through acrylics or by paint or with their voice or with their bodies or with makeup that I never imagined was possible. People are creating cakes and pastries that the world has never seen before. So there's so much creativity going on in the world right now that I always get inspired by that. And the more I see it, the more I realize that I was kind of putting myself into a creative box, if you want to call it. And a lot of us do that. We put ourselves into these creative boxes. It's such a misnomer and such an ironic thing, right? That you're, as a creative person, putting yourself into a box. But I imagine that a lot of us do that. If we were successful in one creative endeavor, we think that we have to be creative like that for the rest of our life. And if we are not creative in that manner, it means that we can't be creative in any other way, shape, or form. That's exactly what I used to think. If I can't write short stories, then I can't be creative in any other way. Even though I was being creative in other ways, I did not label it as being creative. I thought it was just being normal. I was just living my life. Now I realize that there's so many different ways for me specifically to be creative, not only the entire universe, but for me specifically. So then when I change my creativity format, so perhaps I do these videos for a while and then I get bored of them and then I do something else, it doesn't mean that I'm being less creative. It just means that I'm changing the format of my creativity. I'm moving myself perhaps from one creative box to another creative box, or I'm transforming my creativity. Because as individuals, we're always transforming ourselves. Why can't we be transforming our creativity all the time as well? It's only logical that would happen, right? And so I wanted to obviously share these words with you guys, not only because I realize so many people have so many misconceptions about creativity, but I myself have had this misconception about myself for so long. And I know that it's not just one. I have so many, and I've just shared one misconception that I have with you. There's so many doubts and anxieties and fears in my head about my creativity all the time. The only good thing that I know I do with my creativity is I'm creative every single day, no matter what the doubts or fears or anxieties tell me. Even if I tell myself I'm not creative, I still try and write my words every single day. Even though I believe sometimes that I'm not creative or imaginative in any way, I still do these videos just because I know that I have to push myself every single day. And that's the only way I can keep on being creative and pushing my creative work out there, and eventually, hopefully, creating the best, the best seller or that best work that will represent my lifetime. Again, I hope this makes sense to you guys. I hope that I've been able to explain my thoughts and processes to you guys about my creativity and about the creative boxes we put ourselves into. If you guys have any questions at all, please message me anytime. My email is boomshikha@themillionairehippie.com. And if you guys have any video suggestions or podcast suggestions, message me anytime as well. I shall see you guys in the next video, in the next episode. Bye for now.